and my interest in cookbooks. I recently returned to Montana after being away for about 20 years. I was born in Sydney, as I'll tell you in a bit, and went to school in Park City. I graduated from Rocky Mountain College, did a master's degree here at the University of Montana, and left for educational and career purposes. And most recently, I was an English professor at Austin College, a small liberal arts college in North Texas. And I came back about 6 months ago to join the Humanities Montana team. And that gave me a chance to revisit my cookbook research from almost 20 years ago. So I first need to offer about 3 caveats, I think, before I get into this with you tonight. First, I have to say, I am not the greatest cook. I'm an okay cook when I need to. So Aubrey, I will not be submitting a recipe, but I can't wait to see the cookbook come out. So this isn't a cookbook, a cooking demonstration, or really a how-to lecture. Second, I already confessed this to Jamie as we were chatting before. A lot of these cookbooks that I'll be talking about, women's community cookbooks I'll be talking about from the 60s and 70s, are full of recipes with lots of highly processed, non-organic ingredients for casseroles with canned cream of mushroom soup, for example, Jello salad. You get the idea. But they're all cookbooks from agricultural and small agricultural Montana communities. So I think you'll appreciate that aspect of the research. Third, the title of this presentation, The Secret History of Women's Community Cookbooks, might be overstating it a little bit. What I really meant was the overlooked significance of women's community cookbooks as women's life writing, but I didn't think you'd sign up for that. So now you're here, and I'm hoping that you will see the community cookbooks in your collection in a new way after our time together this evening. And I'm not sure if people brought their own cookbooks to share or to talk about from their collections. We will have plenty of time for a conversation and discussion in about 30 minutes when I'll wrap up my comments on cookbooks. So I'll tell you a little bit about how this project started, I think almost 20 years ago. And why I was originally interested in women's community cookbooks from Eastern Montana as a literature research project. So about 20 years ago, I was choosing a topic for my master's thesis in English at the University of Montana. And I knew I wanted to write about portrayals in literature of Western pioneering women on the plains in the prairies. Now, in the literary tradition, a lot of times women from the plains and the prairies are associated with isolation and loneliness and hysteria. And the reason I was interested in this is because I was a product of that part of the world. I was born in Sydney, as I mentioned. My father and his family are from Richland County. My mother and her family come from the Leicester area in Valley County, which is actually where I believe Christy the wordsmith is also from Valley County as well. So when I would look to the literature, when I would see those stories of loneliness and isolation, they didn't always necessarily ring true to me because they were mostly negative portrayals of women's experiences. And there could be something to that for sure, but I knew it wasn't the only story. And that's what Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of a single story. I wanted to know, were there other stories and where could I find them? So that summer, I was visiting my parents and I was helping my mother prepare a feast. My mother, that's Dolores Tanglen, she is here with us. I'll mention more about that later. I was helping my mother prepare a feast for a gathering of our family, and we were preparing dishes from my mother's Mennonite heritage. And I was looking up a recipe for one of the dishes. So I went to my mom's cookbook cupboard and I pulled out this cookbook. Can you see that? What's cooking in Leicester? And okay, so this is where I have to explain a little bit about Mennonites. So my mother was raised in the Mennonite farming community of Leicester in Valley County, and her grandparents and great-grandparents immigrated to Homestead in northeastern Montana in the early 1900s in response to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And the Mennonites in Leicester, especially by the time my mom was growing up and as an adult, weren't strictly traditional like the Amish that you might see on reality television, or the Hutterites that we might meet here in Montana at the local farmers market. So although there are a lot of similarities, the Mennonites in Leicester lived in a close-knit religious community. A lot about daily life and agricultural practices was mainstream. But similar to all immigrant communities, food, the domain of women, was a way to maintain culture and tradition. And that certainly was my connection to my family's Mennonite heritage. Through my mother and through her aunts, I learned about traditional Mennonite foods like vrenica, it's kind of like a dumpling, sort of like pierogi, but a lot better, but we won't tell that to my Polish sister-in-law. Rollkuchen, a type of fried pastry, or pascha, a very rich Easter bread. So kind of going back to looking for my research topic, opening this cookbook to the title page, I saw a list of women who worked together on a committee to create this cookbook in 1968. They would go on to create multiple volumes of What's Cooking in Leicester. I think here's number 2 and number 3. And I found that these were the women of the Mission Society of the Evangelical Mennonite Brethren Church in Leicester, and their names next to each of the recipes that they submitted for the cookbook indicated that dozens of women from the community contributed and submitted their recipes. And it was fun to look through the cookbook and find the names of people I might know or that I'd heard my mom talk about, or maybe I was even related to. And I remember, and these are my copies of the cookbook. You can tell they haven't really been used, but my mom's cookbook that had been in her collection for some time, my memory of it is that it was well worn, and this yellow cover was tattered around the edges, and the pages themselves were full of notes and marginalia in my mom's handwriting. And I'm sure some of you are very familiar with similar notations in your family cookbooks. The splatters on the pages of sauces and batters told stories about our family, about my mom. It documented where we'd come from, where we'd been, and it just brought back memories of family gatherings and the foods associated with them. So that idea then of reading cookbooks for the stories that they told, reading cookbooks as literature, really began to appeal to me. And a poem, actually, that was in the 1960s, What's Cooking in Leicester, it explains why this was so appealing to me. I'm going to recite the poem from memory. I am a little cookbook, a-sittin' on a shelf. Although I'm full of goodies, I'm no good there by myself. I need someone to pick me up and look inside my cover. And if you do, I promise you, a new world you will discover. And I wanted to discover that new world. So I applied for a research grant from what was then the Montana Committee for the Humanities, now Humanities Montana, to research the historical, literary, and cultural significance of women's community cookbooks in Eastern Montana. So I toured the state looking at what I called cookbook archives in libraries and local museums in Billings, Glendive, Miles City. I also went to Huntley Project and Forsyth at one point. But these Leicester cookbooks were my primary sources, my primary case studies. And I interviewed 2 women who were involved with creating these cookbooks, Amanda Wall, who passed away in 2014, and Carolyn Fouth, who lives in Glasgow and was on at least 3 or 4 other cookbook committees in her day. So I'm going to tell you what I found from, and what I found in my research and what humanities-based conclusions I came to. So first, though, I need to share my screen, and I need to speak a little bit about the humanities and what they are. So the humanities allow us to investigate what humans create, write, and record, and why and how they record, create, and write what they do. But all of us every day are participating in the humanities, just in our everyday lives, because the humanities are about how we find and create meaning together. So then what does it mean to examine women's cookbooks through a humanities lens? It means that I was interested in the expressive potential and the possibility for making meaning through women's community cookbooks. And I came to three major conclusions, and I'll tell you what they are now, and then I'll go through each one by one and provide a few examples. So the first conclusion is that cookbooks were a way for women to write themselves into the narrative of local and regional history. My second conclusion is that cookbooks as literature can be read as women's life writing. And my third conclusion was that church and community cookbooks are an unexpected outlet for female leadership and influence in rural Montana communities. So I'll go through these one by one. First, that cookbooks are a way for women to write themselves into the narrative. Now, if there are any Hamilton fans out there in today's audience, you know that this is a line from Eliza in the musical. She says, "I'm going to write myself into the narrative," meaning she's going to tell her story on her own terms. And women don't usually show up in the official historical record of ecclesiastical and church records, military records, government records, unless they were associated with famous or powerful men. And even in that case, they might not. For example, the Schuyler sisters from Hamilton. Now that there's a lot of interest in them, historians are kind of rushing to find what documentation there was of their lives. So scholars of women's history have found that they need to look for other sources to find out about women's lives. And cookbooks are one of those opportunities for women to write themselves and their communities into being. One scholar says that women who thought their lives too ordinary, too everyday to be of interest to others often use their cooking skills and prized recipes as a vehicle for making themselves visible. And so if you think about it, the women who contributed to What's Cooking in Leicester and to other community cookbooks, they were primarily farm and ranch women who had, and that was their identity. And a major task associated with that role was preparing for, planning, cooking, cleaning up meals for families and for their families and for work crews. And this is an essential part of family life and of a farm and ranch enterprise, but it's also not visible work because it's done in the privacy of the homes. And so this is something else women's studies scholars have found, that women's work is often done to be undone. So it's not visible in the way that maybe men's work traditionally is visible. So cookbooks are a way to make women's work and identity concrete and visible, part of the narrative. And I'm not even saying that that was the goal of cookbook authors all the times. It was just the happy, fortunate outcome that we can see that. So here's an example from the St. Margaret's Guild cookbook from Miles City, Montana. Here, all of the contributors to the cookbook signed their names on the cover of the book, literally writing themselves into the narrative with their signatures. Women also write each other into the narrative. So on the pages of the cookbooks, you can trace a matrilineal culinary family tree. I'll give you an example from the Range Riders Museum, Grandma's Favorite Recipes, 1974. I think this cookbook was made right kind of in celebration of the bicentennial of the United States. This cookbook records, like many of them, female kinship relations among women, through the vessel of recipes. So I'll just give you an example. On one page, we see that Doris Tackett submitted great-grandma Essie Northcott's chili recipe. On the next page, Zola Stone submitted her mother Anna Theed's recipe for apple glazed lamb chops. And on the next page, Anna Theed's granddaughter, Mary Labb, submitted her grandmother's recipe for do-ahead buffet dinner. Another recipe for chicken pot pie is just attributed to great-grandma Penner, because I guess everyone knew who that was. And a recipe for smothered beef steak is attributed to mother of Mrs. Alice Hegum by Mrs. George Emick. But I saw more than women writing themselves into the narrative. They were preserving the memory of their communities. Carolyn Fouth, now of Glasgow, describes the cover of the cookbook that she and 9 other women made for the Baylor Home Demonstration Club in 1963. And at that time, Baylor was a dying community. They'd already lost their posts in their school. And so this cookbook emerged, and Carolyn says, on the inside of the cover, we drew our brands and the brands of anyone else who lived in the area. And that's also common in the Range Riders cookbook. I don't know if you can see an example here. The top of every page has a brand. So in any case, we drew our brands, and on the first page, we put the name of the book, the club name, and where we were located, and also the year. The next page, we put the map of Montana and where Baylor was on the map. So literally putting themselves on the map. And here's the cover of What's Cooking in Lester #3. And you can see Lester, a tiny community in northeastern Montana, is highlighted. And Carolyn Fouth drew this map too. As well. She was involved, like I said, in several cookbook projects. Amanda Wall, who was head of the Lester Cookbook Committee for several years, she says that the best thing that came of the cookbook was that because of sales ranging from California to the East Coast over a period of 35 years, their cookbook moved just beyond their church and community, and that people know about us. So writing themselves into the narrative. I don't have any more images to share today, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And that brings me to the second point, that cookbooks as literature can be read as women's life writing. So just as women haven't been as apparent in the historical record, the same is true, not surprisingly, with literature and literary history until more recently, of course. The field of women's life writing looks at women's diaries, journals, letters, and even cookbooks as a form of women's literary expression. And so, like all worthy texts then in the humanities, we can look at cookbooks as life writing and ask, what does it mean? So when I was a college professor in Texas, when I would bring manuscript diaries and letters to my classes, I would ask students to read them like they would a play or a novel or a poem. I have them identify plot and themes and subtext. And so we can do that with the cookbooks too. Themes: community, regional, and ethnic identities, religious piety, the role of wives and mothers, the maintenance of farm and ranch lifestyle. We especially, as I've already shown, we see that theme of female kinship and friendship networks. So we have theme. We can even look for story and plot. For example, I really want to know the plot behind the recipe for, where was this? This was in Grandma's Favorite Recipes from Miles City. What's the plot of the recipe Public Barbecue to Feed 600? I want to know the story behind the recipe for How to Preserve a Husband or Lazy Woman Pickles. I definitely detect a subtext there. And there is definitely a pithiness, right? So we have literary expression and voice as well. And a lot of these cookbooks contain original kind of sayings and poems and narratives, similar to the poem that I quoted earlier in the presentation. But there's definitely a writerly intention and a writerly process. Amanda Wall and Carolyn Fouth spoke of creating multiple drafts, multiple editions and volumes of the cookbooks, and writerly decisions and intention, and especially an awareness of audience, how to organize the recipes. Well, in this next volume, we should have a table of contents and an index, really thinking of the reader. Carolyn Fouth especially discusses the issue of audience. She wrote an email to me once, and I was kind of going through all of these again, preparing for this presentation. She was talking about just the thought that went into how to present and write about Mennonite ethnic food and recipes for third and fourth generation daughters and granddaughters, or for those who are part of the community. So really thinking about an external audience and making the cookbook accessible to them. And so this concept, though, of cookbooks as life writing, the women of Eastern Montana are part of a long history of this. This can be traced back to cookbooks in early modern Europe, of women using these manuscripts to tell stories about their lives and to document their lives. My third point is that church and community cookbooks are an unexpected outlet for female leadership and influence in their communities. And so, to speak just generally about gender roles, it might be useful to consider a concept from, Women's Studies 101 of separate spheres ideology. So this is the cultural ideal popularized by women's magazines and literature in the Victorian era and carried even into the 20th century. We have the male sphere of public, of finance, church, leadership, government, politics, and then the women's private sphere of home and family, and never the two shall meet, except with cookbooks. Because with community cookbooks, women were able to expand that private domestic sphere into the public. And I'm not saying that was necessarily the goal, but that was the outcome, because most community cookbooks were fundraisers. And if women raised the money for the church or the community, they got to say how it was used and to use their influence in that way. So the first community cookbook, this is the earliest I could find documentation of, was probably an 1893 cookbook from Billings, the Progressive Cookbook from what is now First United Methodist Church. Mrs. Alice Floyd Free edited a cookbook of recipes for her Sunday school class to raise $500 to raise money to erase a $500 church debt. The women of Luster, through their church's Mennonite teachings, were especially committed to international mission work, and especially to social justice type projects that would ease human suffering around the world. So the purpose of the three What's Cooking in Luster cookbooks was to raise money for these missionary projects. And the first year that What's Cooking in Luster was published, the women raised $280. This was in 1968. Amanda Wall also told me another story of when the church needed some repairs, that the women just held a quilt auction and they raised the money for their repairs. So I thought that was also another example of, through this, what seems like, what was a very traditional domestic role, women were having a very public facing impact in their communities and in the world that was important to them. I realized, returning to this research after years away from it, I think that I overlooked the importance of that fundraising piece and the pride that women took in it, because I was going that I saved that Amanda Wall had shared with me when I visited her. And when I went through those papers, that she didn't give me copies of recipes or correspondence about the cookbook. She handed me a stack of church finance reports. They were all treasurer's reports that included the mission societies and profits and the cookbook sales. So I thought that was significant. And she had also pulled from those reports a report in her own handwriting that documented from 1968 to 1989, so 21 years, the cookbook sales had profited $5,000. So, and that's what she wanted me to know. Maybe one more thing, because in all of those financial records, I did find a copy of a hymn. And the title of the hymn was "Work Where You Are." And I thought that was very poignant. So just a couple thoughts as I kind of wrap up today. The humanities ask us to reflect upon our lives, our experiences, and how we can and have changed. And doing this research has really changed me and made me more appreciative, coming back to it after these 20 years, of my own female kinship and friendship networks. And like the women in the cookbooks, I want to document those now, the way the pages of the community cookbooks do. So first, my mother, Dolores Tanglen, who is here this evening, she traveled with me on these research trips, and she got what I was doing and supported me on this project from the start and let me use her cookbooks. And my sister Rachel Thurman and my friend Lindsay Brown and Laurel, they traveled with me all over Eastern Montana and the High Line. And Amanda Wall and Carolyn Fouth openly shared their experiences and their wisdom and their knowledge with me. They didn't even know me, but they knew my late grandmother, who was a woman I'd never met, and they knew my great aunts. And speaking of which, I can't forget to mention my great aunt Mary Reddig, who introduced me to Amanda and Carolyn. And of course, my dear professor, Dr. Jill Bergman, mentored me through this research project. So that was my female world of love and ritual and kinship community that I've been reflecting on as I've returned to this cookbook. So this cookbook project. So Jamie, you started with the poignant reflections, and now I have mine too. And there is one more reflection that I've had from doing this research. So to kind of take another turn, this research has back then and even now has made me confront my own legacy of settler colonialism in Montana. My Mennonite ancestors homesteaded on the Fort Peck Reservation, and as a persecuted and displaced people in Europe, they contributed to the persecution and displacement of Indigenous peoples in Montana, particularly the Assiniboine people in northeastern Montana. And while the church cookbook raised money to ease human suffering around the world, they didn't always address suffering in their own community. And I think that's one reason I set this research aside for a while. One reason was that I went to graduate school and was pursuing other research interests, but I think this dilemma just made me feel stuck. But voices from the humanities have helped me gain some perspective to think through, but not necessarily resolve this question. Joanna Brooks, in her memoir, Book of Mormon Girl, she frames it so it's not an either or necessarily. She says, when we belong to a people, we inherit not only the glorious histories of our ancestors, but their human failings too. Their kindnesses, their tenderness, their satisfaction with easy contradictions, their wisdom, as well as their ignorance, arrogance, and presumption, and our own. We inherit their sparkling differences and their human failings. There is no unmixing of the two. When I wrapped up this research in 2003, before I left to go to Arizona to start doctoral studies, I compiled it and I gave a version of this presentation around communities in Eastern Montana, in Glasgow, Miles City, and Billings. And the audiences, similar to tonight, were primarily composed of women, but I was pleasantly surprised to see that there were men who were also interested in this topic. What I didn't expect from the audience questions and comments was that people weren't just rethinking cookbooks. they were rethinking the significance of the lives and work of their female family members, their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, and their aunts. And I hope maybe you will too, because that's what the humanities should do. Help us see the world and our lives and our histories all in a new way.
Thank you, Randi.
So, yeah, thank you, Jamie.
We do have a question that is a nice segue to what you've just been talking about. And that is, what might these cookbooks tell us about women's ties or lack of ties to the generations of women who remained in their countries of origin? For example, what did you learn about your grandmother's family in Eastern Europe?
The cookbooks that I was looking at from Leicester didn't necessarily tie back to specific individuals from the old world, from Europe, but they talked about, like I said, the traditional foods, the Mennonite heritage. I think it was in volume 3 or maybe volume 2, that there was more of an explanation. Oh yeah, Leicester ethnic foods. So there was more of an explanation of the history of the Mennonite community, how they arrived there, but not necessarily ties, the specific ties to the communities, but it was a way of remembering the heritage.
So can I just follow up? Because that was my question. Thank you, Randi.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So you didn't find any evidence that these recipes help them bring that connection to when they came as settlers or as brides or as whatever, that these recipes tied them in some way to the memory of what they left behind?
Oh, I think I didn't necessarily find that in what I was looking at, but I think that there are other scholars who document that for sure. And I had this right next to me. I don't think it's here right now, but actually, Dr. Mary Murphy at MSU Bozeman had a really great article in the MSU alumni journal that just came out about Scandinavian immigrants in eastern Montana and in Sydney, and not necessarily documenting just the recipes, but also the tools for all of the specific types of cookies and things like that. So yeah, food was that connection to an immigrant heritage.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to share a community cookbook that my sister-in-law shared with me. So if I can get that up. And this is also a Roosevelt County Poplar. This is a Centennial cookbook. So you know, there's a lot of pride for being able to include your family's recipe in this. So I think Connie's here. Connie, did you want to say anything? Maybe she's not here.
I'll let you just handle it,
Oh,
Jamie.
okay. Put her on the
You did a
spot.
fine job. That
Yeah.
was a second printing. I learned later because I found the first printing, and what they did is they took the American Legion cookbook that had been a fundraiser, and this one was also, and they did it to help offset some of the expenses for the celebration that they had for 100 years.
Yeah, women writing themselves and their communities into the narrative, a way of documenting the community and the lives in the community.
Yeah. So,
And the artwork was done by the local people, which they gave acknowledgement to in there. And one of the, I think it was the last page, was actually the Skinner's drugstore. So some of the sketches that were done had some of the older businesses that had been in town, and they just wanted to acknowledge them. So, thanks for doing this, Randi. This is fun.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. And you know, your cookbook made me think of an observation that I'd kind of had, that these cookbooks that were made at the grassroots level and almost kind of self-published by communities, at some point there was a change where it became easier for the churches and the women's groups to collect the recipes and send them off to a company that would publish the cookbooks for them. And the cookbooks started to have kind of the same look, so that's why I think that the cookbooks with the original drawings and the covers, they're so precious and they're so interesting because they're not as standardized or formulaic as some of the community cookbooks later on. Not that they are any less significant, more or less significant, but the original artwork and drawings always makes the cookbook so much more interesting.
So we have another scholar who has a question, and that would be my daughter, Gwen.
Hello, thank you, Randy, for this fantastic talk, and a big shout out to Jamie, my mom, for putting on such a wonderful conference. Naming that genealogical, or that the practice of naming your ancestors and who influences you, I think is a wonderful thing that Randy brought up. My question is about the literary tradition and sort of text and subtext going on here. You mentioned the prevalence of women in the West in the agricultural frontier of being depicted as isolated or hysterical. And of course, this is quite a counter to that in how they're controlling the narrative and what they're doing for the community and how they are working together. And I want to draw this in with a tradition that's sort of emergent in women's intellectual history right now of saying, intellectual history isn't just coming from people who give speeches or people who garner national attention, but it's the everyday workings that, especially with women's intellectual history, that women undertake to survive. So my question is about within these cookbooks, and there totally might not be, but I'm wondering if there are texts or subtexts that directly counter these ideas of isolation. I mean, the existence of them, the books themselves sort of do, but I'm wondering how these women maybe poke fun at or speak to ideas of loneliness or friendship or community in rural agricultural areas. And also if there might be any sort of signals within these texts that would be legible to women in the area, but maybe not to other people. And I ask this all in the hopes that we recognize the intellect and the navigation and the genius of our foremothers in these texts. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, those are all just great points, Gwen. That idea of looking low to find, documentation of women's lives, that's certainly part of looking at women's intellectual history, right? I don't know that, I think I'd be kind of forcing it to say that the cookbooks were directly speaking back to a masculinist literary tradition. I think it's exactly how you put it. The cookbooks themselves are evidence of female community in isolated places. I'd have to probably look at more cookbooks, but I didn't notice any kind of subtext or signaling back to that tradition.
Okay, so I'm just going to put a little aside here too, because we are the Montana Organic Association. So oftentimes we're concerned with weeds. We had a research update today from our Montana State University professors. And, one of the banes of farmers' existence is thistle, Canadian thistle. They call it California thistle in New Zealand, apparently. And I do know that there is a recipe in an extension document from, I think, the 1910s that talks about pickling thistle. And so I think those extension records are just unmined ore for some amazing views of the past. So Carla's comment is, it's interesting to think about the desire for convenience. For example, cream of mushroom soup and Jell-O after World War II, and the turn towards organic foods in the 1980s. do we both learn and unlearn from these generational cookbooks?
When I remember that when I brought up that, well, Carla, did you want to respond to that?
Only that it seems like we both learn and reject from our ancestors.
Yeah. And then it all comes back full circle at some point too. I remember when I gave this presentation, I think it was in Miles City, one of the women said, well, the reason we used those foods was out of convenience, like the processed and the canned foods was out of convenience. And then just one more point, just more by means of observation about things coming full circle. The Mennonite, what's cooking in Leicester, every recipe has lard in it because that's what was that, not every recipe, but that was kind of a key ingredient. And I was reading recently that lard has come back. Well, you might know this. Lard has come back because of the keto movement or the keto movement. So it's like so something that once had a stigma because it was old fashioned or something now is in vogue.
I think keto too, and the whole idea of tail to nose. So using as much of the animal as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And reducing food waste. Aubrey might be able to speak to that better than me. Mary Murphy has a statement, I guess. In case people want to know the scope of Montana Community Cookbooks, the State Historical Society now has over 1,000 of these, dating from the 1880s to the present. Some are digitized and part of the Montana Memory Project.
That's great. And here is, this is the article I was referencing, Good Food in Hard Times by Mary Murphy. And she references, I believe, a thistle recipe. Russian thistles cooked when tender made a very good substitute for greens.
There you go. And you can pickle them too. Anna, let's see. First, I'll go to Jeanette has another comment. Each time she teaches history of food at Carroll College, or Zoanne Stoltz from the Historical Society brings some sample cookbooks, and each time at least one recipe of those, someone in the class recognizes their ancestors. So that's just the nature of the Montana community.
That's Montana.
Yep.
Yep.
And then Anna Jones Crabtree, who's north of Havre, says, is anyone researching what native plants we have here and how they are incorporated into our food system? So many of our cultivated crops are not native to North America.
I'm not sure about that. Does anyone else here know about that?
Rosalind Lapierre at University of Montana. It's a botanist. Carla, you probably know her better than I do. If you know, I'll put a link. She's an amazing scholar.
Randy, there was an earlier question about whether or not you saw any sense of place in the cookbooks when you were doing your research.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the whole putting ourselves on the map. And also a lot of the cookbooks are about maintaining a lifestyle based on agriculture and agricultural communities, and that's certainly connected to place. So not in the overt way that, you know, a memoirist might write about place and location, but certainly we are of this place and our lifestyle is of this place, this specific place. Yes, Sarah's making the point about some research and publication on food sovereignty and indigenous foodways. and the Sous Chef's Cookbook is one. And there's another book that just came out from University of Nebraska Press. Of course, I don't remember the idea off the top of my head, but it is about indigenous foodways
We have
with recipes.
Mariah Gladstone too, from Montana, who has the Indigit
Okay.
Kitchen. I do know that one of the best places to get lunch in DC is the Museum of Native Americans. The Smithsonian has amazing food. National Museum of American Indian. Thank you, Gwen. So any more questions or comments or things to share? Well, thanks everyone for your time. And thanks, Randi, so much. Do you plan on continuing this work in any way?
Probably, yeah, to some extent or another. I will definitely look at the cookbooks on the Montana Memory Project and see what's there and look for some great examples there. But, and I wanted to thank you, Jamie, for this invitation. I don't think I would have returned to the research without that prompting. So thank you for this opportunity to share it with you and for giving me the opportunity to look at the research with fresh eyes.
Well, thank you again. It's the Montana Organic Association is a diverse group. You know, we stretch from one end of the state to the other. That includes large scale grain and pulse farms, ranches, and then small scale orchards and direct to market farms that you might be maybe more familiar with through your farmer's market. And, you know, it's a range of folks. I don't think there's a typical Montana organic farmer that I've ever met. So part of what connects us is the community and our commitment to organics. And, you know, we make sure, just like organic farming, that it is, when we get together, it's diverse and we have diverse offerings. And so I thank you very much for adding a richness to our virtual meeting, which has been really difficult for us to not meet in person, but I really appreciate your time and all of your energy, and I appreciate everyone who's shown up tonight. Thank you. There is a request to unmute everyone and to give Randi an applause. So if you can, I'll go ahead.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you. This has been a delight. Thank you, everyone.
So much. Oh, and a reminder of Aubrey's recipe contest. So if you're involved with Harvest of the Month or know a student, there's a chance to win $500 by using some of the ingredients that are featured in Harvest of the Month.
And this has nothing to do with food, but Jeanette, are you really in Venice?